Hi, I'm Rob, N1NUG, and today I want to talk about the process of adding a park to the POTA database. Now, if you're new to ham radio or new to POTA, Parks on the Air, the first thing that I want to encourage you to do is go to the website and read through all of the rules and operating guides that they have on the official POTA website. This video is not intended to take the place of that information. Rather, I'm going to show you how I'm going to follow that information to hopefully get a park added here in Connecticut. I'm going to start from the beginning just so you kind of have the backstory and thought process that I'm using to justify asking for this park to be added, but hopefully I won't ramble on too much and bore you. Anyway, I was looking over Google Maps the other day for a non-ham radio, non-POTA related thing, and I came upon Bigelow Hollow State Park, which is a POTA entity. It's in the database as US 1648, and I've activated there plenty of times. But I happened to realize that there was a boundary marker between Bigelow Hollow State Park and the surrounding Nipmuc State Forest. Now, I guess I kind of already knew, but didn't really think about it, but Nipmuc State Forest itself is not in the POTA database. But then I started to wonder why. I wasn't sure if Bigelow Hollow and Nipmuc State Forest were just kind of two different names for the same kind of thing or piece of property, if you will, or if they were two separate entities. So I started to do some digging and looking at sort of the Connecticut State Park website, and I came to the conclusion that they are kind of two different things. Bigelow Hollow is a state park with a boat launch and picnic tables and stuff like that. You actually have to pay a fee to get in there in the summertime, whereas Nipmuc State Forest has no fee. Now, it does have sort of its own boat launch on a different pond, and it's got something called the Mountain Laurel Sanctuary, where you can go and when mountain laurel is in bloom and see all the flowers, that kind of a thing. But you don't have to pay anything to get into Nipmuc State Forest. And when I started looking at boundary maps, I sort of came to the conclusion that they were, in fact, two distinct separate entities within the Connecticut State Park and State Forest system. So then I thought maybe it would be worthwhile to see if we could get Nipmuc State Forest added to the database so that we've got another place to activate from here in northeastern Connecticut. Now that I had come to the conclusion that I found a park that I wanted to see if I could get added to the database, I needed to figure out how to go about doing that. Now, I already knew that it wasn't something I could do myself, and I already knew that I needed to email the Connecticut mapping coordinator for POTA, and I happen to already know the mapping coordinator for POTA for Connecticut. That's Steve, NK1V. He's actually been in one of my videos a couple of years ago when we did a Connecticut POTA meetup down in southern Connecticut. But I knew that it wasn't as simple as just emailing him and saying, "Hey Steve, add this park." I wanted to go through and make sure that I wasn't going to be wasting his time, and also that my park meets the criteria to be added to the POTA database. The first thing that I wanted to do was figure out what qualifies as a park. And I figured the best way to do that was to read the POTA documentation. So I came over to the main POTA website, parksontheair.com, and I went to the Help Getting Started page and chose Rules, Facts, and Guides. When we first land on the page, we're in the Docs Home section. Now on the Rules page, I saw down here Section 2B, Qualification of Parks, Trails, and Rivers for addition to Parks on the Air. That seemed like what I wanted, so I clicked on that. You can read through all these in detail if you want, but I'll paraphrase each of these bullet points. For the United States, the first qualification is that the park needs to be owned by a state or federal agency. It can't be a city or county or private park. For example, Central Park in New York City is a big, well-known, prominent park, but it's owned by the city of New York City and doesn't qualify to be in the POTA database. The park we're looking at, Nipmuc State Forest, is owned by the state of Connecticut, so it passes qualification number 1. Qualification number 2 is that the park needs to have its own website. or something detailing its boundaries. And Nipmuc State Forest does indeed have its own website and boundary maps, which we will take a look at shortly. The third qualification is that the park that we want to add should not be a sub-park within a larger park. Now, this is where we may run into some trouble with Nipmuc State Forest, but we'll talk about that in a little more detail in a minute. And qualification number 4 requires us to refer to the Park Addition and Edits section of the POTA rules and regulations. So let's go ahead and do that now. So if we come down to the activator reference, you can see that over here on the right side, the table of contents, down at the bottom, we have the Park Additions and Edits section. So we'll click on that. So this gray paragraph here really is the main set of instructions that we need to follow. And really all it says is that we need to find our mapping representative from the list and email them. So if we click on the mapping representatives link and go to United States of America, if I scroll down, we can see right here, Steve's name is listed. And if we click on his call sign, we will get his email address. But like I said earlier, I don't want to just blindly email Steve and throw this onto his lap. I want to give him as much information as possible so he can make an informed decision as to whether he thinks this park should be added or not. So I'm going to back up a couple of steps and I'm going to go through all this information that's here about the criteria that are used to determine whether a POTA park should be added or not. So we'll start off at the top and click on Section 1. Now, Section 1 really just re-explains the criteria that are used to judge whether a park qualifies or not. And we've kind of already gone through this, and we think that Nipmuc does qualify. But again, we're going to skip that just for a second, and we're going to scroll down and look at the park qualification in a little bit more detail. This first paragraph lets us know that there's no obligation from either the POTA organization or the mapping coordinator or anybody to add a park to the database, whether it meets criteria or not. So we'll skip the next few sections because they don't apply to Nipmuc State Forest. But the one that we're kind of sticking on is this one, whether or not it's a sub-park. Now it says here that POTA doesn't create parks within parks under the same agency. And they give an example of a United States Forest Service campground within a United States Forest Service national forest. It could be argued, and this may be the case, I'm not completely certain, but Nipmuc State Forest may be the bigger park. In other words, Bigelow Hollow may be an area within Nipmuc State Forest, and therefore Bigelow Hollow should be renamed to Nipmuc State Forest. And we keep the reference number of US 1648, and we move on with just the one park. However, after I've done some research, I really don't think that's the case. So we finally come to the State of Connecticut website for Nipmuc State Forest and Bigelow Hollow State Park. Now they've kind of bundled the two on one web page here, but if I read this description here, it makes me think that they're treating the two as separate entities. Nipmuc State Forest and the adjoining Bigelow Hollow State Park offer over 9,000 acres of recreation opportunities, blah, blah, blah. I would think that if Bigelow Hollow were part of the Nipmuc State Forest, this wouldn't be the word adjoining, it would be enclosed or Nipmuc State Forest, encompassing Bigelow Hollow State Park, blah, 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 so on and so forth. The word adjoining here makes me think that the two are separate entities that are next to each other. Now, if we go down here to the maps section and take a look at what the state of Connecticut gives us for a map, we can see clearly that Nipmuc State Forest is shown in green and Bigelow Hollow State Park is shown in orange. And it doesn't say anywhere on here that Nipmuc State Forest encompasses Bigelow Hollow, even though it kind of surrounds it. So I'm going to write up my request with all of the information I just explained to you and put it in an email with some links to these maps and send it off to Steve and see what he thinks. But before I do that, I started wondering whether or not this situation exists with any other state parks and state forests in Connecticut. And I did find an example. There may be others, but this is the one that I found. So if we zoom in here and take a look, we can see two POTA parks. One over here, Salmon River State Forest, 7541. And over here, we can see Day Pond State Park, 1660. And if I zoom in a little closer, you can see we've got a very similar situation as we have with Nipmuc and Bigelow. Day Pond State Park is here. You can see the dark green line, hopefully, that kind of shows the boundary of Day Park. And then over here, this other green area is the Salmon River State Forest. In fact, this right here is the Salmon River itself. So now let's take a look at what the state of Connecticut thinks about Salmon River. Now, you can see there's 3 links here, and if I click on this one, we can take a look at this map, and we can see again, Day Pond State Park is in orange and looks to be separate from the Salmon River State Forest, which is listed in green here. I know I keep repeating myself here, but I want to be clear. Even though we have a precedent with Day Pond and Salmon River, the decision to add or not add this park is entirely up to Steve, and I'm going to go with whatever he thinks is the right thing to do. Of course, I'm hoping he adds the park, but if he doesn't, it's no big deal. POTA and ham radio are just a hobby. It's just a pastime, and if he decides for whatever reason, doesn't matter what it is, that he doesn't want to add Nipmuc State Forest, then life will move on. We'll just activate from Bigelow Hollow and still have fun. Here's a look at the email that I sent to Steve. You can see at the top, I asked him if we could add Nipmuc State Forest to the database, and then I gave him some links that he could look at for boundary maps and even a pinned location on Google Maps where I thought the best activation location would be and where he could put the yellow dot on the POTA map. So let's send this off to Steve and see what he thinks. Now, today happened to be my wife's birthday, so after I finished filming that last clip, I took her out for a nice dinner. Well, we got home and I checked my email and I had a response from Steve. Not only did he agree that Nipmuc should be in the POTA database, he actually added it already. And here's a look at the reply from Steve. You can see that he had already been thinking about adding Nipmuc State Forest, but I think he was having trouble finding a good access point for the forest. So I think that information that I sent him with the boundary maps in that pinned location of the entry point at the Mountain Laurel Sanctuary was enough information for him to kind of finish it off and get it in the database. It looks like I've got a new park to activate in the morning, and you might as well come along with me and we'll be the first ones to get this thing on the air. I'm here at the Laurel Sanctuary. You can see the sign right there that Steve saw in the street view when he looked it up. It's a little bit of a snowy morning also, as you can see, and I don't think anybody's here yet because there's nobody in the parking area, there's no tire tracks there. And what I'm actually surprised to see is that down the access road here, there is no gate and there's also no tire tracks. So I'm going to head down in here a little ways. There's a spot where there's some picnic tables and I think that's a good place to operate from. So here's one of the spots where there's a picnic table. They're just right off the side of the access road here. Now there's one a little further down. I was surprised to see that one even had a fire ring. And the picnic tables themselves and the fire ring actually look pretty new. So I guess the state of Connecticut has done a little bit of refreshing in here. Either way, I think we're going to use this one. I've got the car kind of just in front of me there, and I'm going to operate from in the car since it's cold out. But I think I'm going to set my end fed up in this little clearing, and we'll see what we can do. If you've ever seen any of my other POTA videos, you're probably familiar with how I tend to operate from the car. I've got my coax running in and it's just hanging over the third row of seats, and I'll show you the operating position in a minute. The antenna that I'm going to use today is my Reliance Antennas end-fed half-wave, and I've just got this draped in the Mountain Laurel right here as sort of the feed point. I think it'll be okay. Actually, I'm going to kind of put it up here, I think, just to keep it more level. But anyway, the wire is just going up over here, and I've got my 30-foot fiberglass pole set up and just propped in this larger laurel bush over here. Now this spot is famous, especially in the beginning of June when the mountain laurel blooms. It's just beautiful in here with all the flowers and stuff. So I wouldn't set up this way at that time of year. In fact, I think the better setup, now that I'm looking things over, would have been to have the car more or less where I'm standing now and to put the antenna leaned up in the tree there that's behind me. Next time. I think this will work for now. So here is my operating position. I'm obviously sitting in the third row. I've got the second row folded over as my work table. Bioenno 15 amp battery is in here. We got the FT891 with the coax plugged in the back. Got my phone for logging, some Altoids, and of course my glasses so I can see what I'm doing. And I've got my buddy heater set up and on low, and this should heat up in here just within a few minutes. Now you can also see I've got the windows cracked for ventilation, so we won't have any issues there. Now on standby, I've got my collection of ham sticks over here, and I've got a tuner if I need it for use with the ham sticks. But let's see what we can do with the end-fed half-wave first. I didn't end up recording any of the actual contacts during the activation, so I'll just show you my logbook. If you see your call sign in here, let me know if you worked me at the Nipmuc State Forest. I started off my activation on 40 meters, and you can see here that the first person to contact me was WD4DAN. I ended up making 105 contacts in about 90 minutes. And then after I had wrapped up and was getting ready to leave, I remembered to check 2 meter simplex and made 2 more contacts there. I ended up having such a big pileup on 40 meters that I ended up having to run the numbers. And if you're not familiar with what that means, as I was calling QRZ, instead of just opening it up to everybody, I would ask for stations with, say, a 1 in their call sign. And then once I exhausted all of those, I would ask for stations with a 2 in their call sign. It ends up taking a little bit longer maybe to run through all the stations that want to participate, but it ends up giving everyone a chance to participate because with such a big pileup, it was really hard to pick out any call signs. Close to the top of the hour, somebody came in and told me that a net was about to start on the frequency that I was using, which I think was 7.195. And the timing was pretty good because I had just gotten to the 9 stations while I was running the numbers. So I was able to close out the hour. And then I moved to another frequency on 40 meters to try and finish out that pileup. After that, I ended up going to 10 meters and made a handful of contacts over there, and then switched over to 15 meters and finished up my activation on that band. Around the time that I switched bands from 40 meters to 10 meters, my buddy heater ran out of propane. I had checked it out before I left the house, and I thought the propane tank was half full, but I guess it was less than half full. But despite that, I finished out the rest of my activation and really didn't get too cold in the car, even though I didn't have any heat at that point. Now, during this activation, I just sat on a frequency and called CQ, but interestingly enough, with the 105 contacts that I made, there were no park-to-park contacts. Now, at the end, I probably could have gone hunting myself, but I was sort of running out of time, so I didn't do that. However, I did end up doing a short activation at this same park the next day on 20 meters and made a couple of park-to-park contacts then. This just might be my new favorite park. It's nice and quiet here. Nobody's come by, although it is, as you can see, a snowy morning. But this is also the highest point in Windham County, Connecticut. And I think it's the 3rd highest point in all of eastern Connecticut. And I think that helped out, especially on 10 meters with some of those local contacts I had. I hope you enjoyed going through the process of getting this park added with me. And I want to take a minute to thank Steve for reviewing it and getting it added so quickly. I really didn't expect him to do that, but it made for a fun morning here on a snowy January day. I hope you enjoyed the video. 7-3, and thanks for watching.